Klahowya. My name is Sally. I'm a ranger here at Lewis and Clark National Historical Park, Fort Clatsop, on the homeland of the Clatsop and Chinook. Welcome to this virtual In Their Footsteps guest speaker event sponsored by the Lewis and Clark National Park Association, the park's nonprofit partner supporting educational opportunities and operating the exceptional Fort Clatsop Bookstore in the Visitor Center and at fortclatsopbookstore.com. I met today's guest speaker, author Jane Kirkpatrick, over 20 years ago when she was researching Marie Drouin, and some friends brought her and Jerry to Fort Clatsop. Once her first book on Marie, A Name of Her Own, was published, we hosted a talk by Jane here. That was such a good experience that it inspired these In Their Footsteps programs that we have now been enjoying for almost 20 years. I think this is the 9th time we've been privileged to host a unique presentation by Jane. We're recording this program on September 9th, 2021, and Jane Kirkpatrick will answer questions live in the chat when this is broadcast on Facebook Premiere September 19th. In a moment, Jane will share stories about some wonderfully unruly women, including Abigail Scott Duniway, early Oregon suffragist. Duniway is the lead character in Kirkpatrick's 2020 historical fiction book, Something Worth Doing, which is also the title of today's talk. Please type your questions and comments into the chat box. We'll be watching for those and plan to answer in the chat during the talk. Now it is time for Something Worth Doing with Jane Kirkpatrick.
Thank you, Sally, very much. It's a pleasure to be back for In Her Footsteps, and it's always fun to talk about unruly women, which it appears that almost all of my novels have been about. And so it's a great opportunity to come and talk about a couple more of them today. So what I'll be doing is telling you some stories because that's what I do, but that's also what you all do, because stories are the most powerful way we have of organizing human experience. D.H. Lawrence said, the stories tell us who we are and who we will become. And when William Faulkner accepted the Pulitzer Prize in 1954, he said the only stories with a writer's blood and sweat and tears were stories of the human heart in conflict with itself. Willa Cather, who also won the Pulitzer, she was also an unruly woman. She said that the stories that engage us as adults, the ones that we sort of remember, are based on experiences that we had before we turned 15. And I find that really intriguing because that's such a volatile time in everyone's life, is that adolescent period. She said the emotions that drive those stories are passion and betrayal. And I would add a couple of more, since I can remember being 15, it wasn't that long ago. But I would add a couple more. One is acceptance, because I think as an adolescent, that's part of what the journey is to sort of find ourselves and to find ourselves in as a part of the community. And all of these unruly women that I write about, that's part of their journey too, is to find acceptance. E.L. Forrester, who wrote the book Passages to India, said, give me in a story and you'll have a reader for life. So I think that's part of what we come to stories about, is to sort of find ourselves. And then the other emotion that I think helps draw us into those stories that we remember is what I describe as forgiveness, that we look at stories as a way of identifying other ways that people dealt with stupid decisions, because at 15, I made a lot of stupid decisions. And I'm looking in stories to see if I can find out, well, how did these people deal with the mistakes they made or the things that drew them into places they wish they hadn't been, and how did they get out of that? I think that's why I'm so drawn to stories about actual historical characters or people, and particularly women, because I think they have the ability to inspire us and help us to step from their generation into this generation, and hopefully heal us and inspire us and move us and inform us with their lives. So today I want to talk to you mostly about Abigail Scott Duniway, who was an early suffragist, as Sally mentioned. And I have on my um, shirt here a little banner that was a replica of what was worn in the 1920s, and that build up to getting to the 19th Amendment passed. In Oregon, we were able to get to be able to get our own right to vote for women in 1912, which was ahead of the federal level, but it was behind a whole lot of other states too. But this says votes for women, and that's what people would wear these banners. And so I'm going to tell you some stories today based on the letters in the word votes. So that'll kind of, keep us going, and you'll be able to figure out how long I'm really going to talk. So when I get to the S, you'll know we're getting to the end. But before I do that, I want to just give you just a brief little assignment. And I've given this assignment to, European Council of International Schools, where I spoke, and I've given it to the Oregon Mayor's Conference, and I give it to book clubs when I meet with book clubs. And it's two parts. Several people have said to me, it's the only thing they remember that I ever said. And so I don't want to deprive you of potentially, the greatest piece of information I can share. And it's two parts. And the first part is just to ask yourself what experience it is you wanted to have by coming here today, by deciding to hook on to Facebook Premiere and spend the day, not the day, but spend the next few minutes with me and talking about these interesting women. And I ask that because that's what I have to ask the characters in my story. What are they doing here? What was Abigail Scott Duniway? What did she want? What was her desire? She came to Oregon in the 1852 migration, which was one of the first big migrations where women and children, whole families came. There were other family migrations, the Applegates and so on came out much earlier, but 1852 was the huge influx of actual families. Whole towns would shut down and they would go together and head west on the Oregon Trail. So, part of the question I had to answer is, what did she want there? She was a young woman at that point. She was 16, and she had, her mother had 12 children. They were not all living at that point, but it was a big family event that came west. And so, what did she want out of it? Is part of my question in the journey of the story. But the other reason I ask you to think about what experience you want to have is that I really do think that life is short. And in this pandemic, we've really been reminded of that. And so every day is a day where we can make decisions about how do we want to live our lives. And so I think, at least for me, if I will actually name a desire or an experience I want to have, whether I'm going to an event or whether I'm doing this presentation or whether I'm, working in the garden or I get up in the morning, if I ask myself, well, what experience do you want to have? It increases the likelihood about 99% that I'll actually have that experience. And so, there are lots of people who know what they want. And often we actually help them get what they want. We know what our children want and our grandparents want and what our sister wants, our employers want. But when somebody says, well, what do you want? Sometimes it's really hard for us to name that. So I just want to give you some potentials for this, 45 minutes that we're going to have together. You may have come for the wisdom. You have some questions. You were interested in suffrage, or interested in what the Lewis and Clark Historical Center provides. I don't think I had the name right, but you all know where we are. So you might have looked for wisdom. Maybe you came just to have that same acceptance, to find other people, to connect with other people who care about history. Maybe you came for inspiration. Maybe you came for nurture. But just for a minute, think about that. Writer Madeleine L'Engle said, we are named by the choices we make. So if we want to be inspired, or we want to be nurtured, or we want to be encouraged, it'll depend on what decisions that we make. And then the second half of the assignment, and I love my voice suddenly got weird. Hang on a second. Is to ask yourself what the barriers are that you usually put up that would keep you today from having that experience. And again, I ask that because that's what I have to ask the characters in my books. Much of my research about whether it's Abigail Scott Duniway or my latest book is about a musicologist who helped work with Native Americans in the early 1900s to preserve their music at a time when Indian music and culture was being greatly suppressed. That I'm always asking them, well, what got in the way of them having their experience? What are the barriers? And so a writer, especially of fiction, will present a desire someone wants, and then you set up trouble for them, because none of you would read a book that didn't have trouble in it. I mean, in our life, we don't want trouble, but in our novels, we want people to have some trouble they have to overcome. And what happens when that goes on is that the characters are being carved out by the way they handle their troubles. And actually, the Greek word for character means to chisel. And that suggests that it's what's left after you've been gouged out that really is our character. And I always say that's why I don't personally like soap operas, because those people have a lot of trouble, but they don't learn anything from their trouble. I mean, their character is not carved out. And so I ask people, I ask the second assignment because um, I think if we take the time to sort of think about, well, what keeps me from having those experiences that I want to have, that is a way of helping us decide how we're going to carve our own character out. So you might come for acceptance, to just be, with other people, for connection. And then maybe you get here and you think, there are other things I could do. I don't think I need to be watching this. And so I'm going to go do those things. And if that feels good, I say, go do that. But often it's just that we start to get critical of how we've chosen to spend our time, and we don't give ourselves permission to sort of connect with other people. Even in the chat room, you can find other people who are interested in history or interested in women's history or Lewis and Clark. So, or you might have come for wisdom, you have questions you'd like to ask. And then if you're like me, I sometimes get kind of critical of the speaker. Well, what does she really know? Is she a historian? And I'm not. I'm an amateur historian. Does she have a Master of Fine Arts? She writes these novels, and no, I don't. My background is in clinical social work, which you wouldn't think would ever sort of morph into writing almost 40 novels now. Or maybe you might ask yourself whether Oprah knows her name. Should we listen to her if Oprah doesn't know her name? And no, Oprah doesn't know my name. But the thing that is critical about that is when I start to get very critical of a speaker, because I put up all these, roles, what I discover is that I may not have the wisdom that you are interested in, but there's probably somebody on the chat who could help answer your question. There's probably somebody at Lewis and Clark who could probably help answer your question. So to not hold back, if you have a thought or a question, to be sure to ask that. And then maybe you came for inspiration, which is a word, the act of breathing in. And that's one of the reasons why I agree to do these presentations and have been doing In Her Footsteps all these years, is because I really hope that I can bring something to your life about these women, these men and women, about their lives that might give you something to take with you, something to breathe in and have with you for the long haul. So today, for the good news is I hope you have the experience you came to have. And the bad news is it's whatever you decide, however you decide to fill your desire. So I hope you'll be good to yourself today. And with that, I'd like to talk to you about Abigail. As I mentioned, she came with her family in 1852, and she is known in the Northwest for having sustained over 40 years a desire to get women the vote. And that was an incredible journey. And one of the questions I asked myself is, where did she draw her strength from? How did she persist in that? So I'm going to talk about that by talking about votes. And the V word for vote stands for vulnerable. Abigail, and vulnerable is also from the Latin, we get the word wounded. And Abigail felt that all women were vulnerable in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, 1880s, and then well into the early 1900s when women finally got the vote. So how were women vulnerable? Why did she think that? Well, in part because we were almost non-persons. Oregon was rare in allowing women to have property in their own name. And that didn't, it was only married women at that point until later when the Homestead Act was passed and women could prove up property in their own name. But for many women, they were non-entities, didn't have the right to have property, didn't have, for example, I know in doing research that there were wills that needed, when men died, if they didn't put in their will that their wife's clothing should be given to her, she would not necessarily have her clothing. That was one of the pieces of property that needed to be identified, or she literally was unclothed, I mean, technically or legally, because women just didn't have access. They didn't have access to education. Abigail had very little time, maybe a couple of terms as a child growing up. Her brother was well educated. He was actually the first graduate of Pacific University in Forest Grove. And so, but he was able to get education, and boys were assumed to be, that was important to educate them, but girls, not so much. Women didn't have control of their own earnings. Most what women could do during that time that was respectable were to be teachers, run a boarding house, maybe do laundry for pay, but the earnings were not their own. The earnings went to either their father or to their husband who had control over that. Abigail was fortunate when she got married. She got married very shortly after they arrived in Oregon to Ben, they were married for many years together, and he was actually one of the first house husbands, I like to say, because he realized what this incredible woman he had married, what a powerhouse she was. And he was not at all uncomfortable staying at home while she traveled, while she supported the work of the suffrage programs. He cooked, he cleaned, he actually invented a washing machine, because laundry was another place where women were incredibly vulnerable, because it was so much work, and there were often women who were badly burned because of the effort that went into doing laundry. So I love it that Ben decided his one invention would be to make a woman's life easier doing laundry. So another place where women were vulnerable, of course, they couldn't change anything about their life because they didn't have the power to vote. So that became for Abigail, and actually for Ben too. She writes in her memoir called Path Breaking that she and Ben were having a conversation about what could she do, how could she make a difference. She worried about her own daughter. She had one daughter and five sons, and she worried about how her daughter was going to make it in the world. And he said to her, don't you think the best way to make that happen is that women would be allowed to vote, so that they could make decisions about what was affecting their life economically, educationally, maritally, all of those things. And so, and they actually described it as kind of an inspirational moment. She really felt there was a divine inspiration in saying, yes, that's what I need to devote my life to. So the V word is really about how she tried to deal with the vulnerability that she saw in the lives of women especially. But she also believed that it would make men's lives better too. if women were treated more equal than they had been, and if women were not overburdened, for example, when their father died or their husbands died, they were often the ones that were left with the debt. And so if women could make a difference in how that was managed, how debt was managed, that would actually make it better for whole families for how to move forward. So the O word stands for being open. And what I've learned about so many of these women I've written about is that they had to be open to new ways and new thoughts about how to proceed. One of the things that Abigail was pretty open about is that she passed the teacher's test, despite the fact that she didn't have a formal education. And so she got a job, and this was before she was married. She got a job as a teacher, and loved it, even though she said she would have to get up at like 3 in the morning and study the lesson so that she was a little bit ahead of where the kids were, because she didn't really know all these things that she was trying to teach. She also decided once she got married, she lost that job. That was another sort of very often married women were not considered appropriate educators. And so she was looking around for how else could she help contribute to the family income. They lived on a kind of a remote farmstead at that point around the area around Albany and that particular part of Oregon. So when she would then raise, she had chickens, she had egg money, they had cows, she made butter, and then she sold those things at the local markets. Eventually, because of some poor decisions that Ben made, he co-signed some loans with a friend, and Abigail had heard him in the living room talking about this, and she came in and tried to dissuade him from doing this because the interest rate was really high. And but Ben said, "Oh, don't you worry, he's good for it." And well, he wasn't good for it, and they lost their farm. They were able to sell it, but they sold it at a loss, and basically all of their money went in to pay off that debt. So Abigail had put aside some of her egg money, and she had bought some property in Albany. And so they moved into Albany, and that's when Abigail said, "Okay, we have to find some other ways here to make a living." Ben wanted to keep working. He worked for other farmers, and he worked to train horses. So that was how he was bringing in income. And she began with a boarding school or a boarding house. And so they turned the attic into 3 or 4 beds, and they would, house different young women from the community. And then she started a school called the Union School. So everybody knew where she stood in terms of the Civil War that was going on. And she was having children during this time. So, I mean, she kept having babies while she was doing all this. And then she got the idea to run a millinery, and she needed money to sort of manage that. So she, with great bravery, and again, this was being open to some new ways that women had to endure, she went to Portland and got Jacob Meyer. She wanted to get a small loan from him so that she could go to California and buy products and then bring them back. And the amount she asked for, he saw in her this spark of an amazing personality. And he said, "I won't loan you," I think it was $1,000 she wanted to borrow, "but I'll loan you $3,000. And so she went to California, and that's where she first learned about suffrage and first became involved in more active women's promotion of the vote. She came back. During this time, Ben also had just a tragic accident, and his back was injured, and he had a lifelong struggle with chronic pain. And anybody who's ever had to deal with chronic pain, you know what that's like. There are good days and there are bad days. And so Abigail became even more inspired that she needed to be the breadwinner, and she needed to make sure they always had adequate income. And eventually, her big decision was to start a newspaper This was incredibly rare for a woman at that time. And this was in the 1870s by then. And she started a newspaper called the New Northwest, which was designed primarily for women and to promote the causes of women. You can go online and you can bring some of those newspapers up. And there are also a couple of books that have been written that pull together some of the articles in that newspaper. Really quite remarkable. She wrote a lot of the pieces, and she started writing novels. She wrote, I think it was 20 novels in the midst of all this. So, I mean, I don't know when she slept. I really don't. But anyway, she was open to trying to be a newspaper writer. And eventually, as her children got older, the whole family was involved in writing and doing this newspaper. And then she also became much more active in doing public speaking. And in 1871, she was able to convince Susan B. Anthony, the well-regarded and well-known suffragist from New York, to come out and do a tour in the Northwest. And she and Susan B. Anthony traveled around. They got eggs thrown at them and tomatoes, and just terrible things happened for them. Heckled at the Oregon State Fair. It didn't deter them. They were adamant that women needed to know that there were other people out there, that they were not alone in some of the trials that they had. And so the third letter is T, and that stands for tools. And Abigail had one of the best tools she had available to her was her imagination. And I think sometimes we don't think about that in our life as being a tool, but all of us, and if that can be inspired and nurtured, whether we as parents nurture that for our children or our grandchildren, the ability to think about how it could be, to dream, to use your imagination to make that happen. And that was one of her gifts, is that she did inspire people to try new things. She would actually go into jails where women were, confined perhaps because they didn't pay their father's debt. She would go with them to court. And again, because she was highly skilled as a speaker, which was another great tool she had. Writing and speaking are two different kinds of talents, and she had both of them. And she used them on behalf of women and what women needed to move forward. She would go into mental asylums or mental hospitals to see what she could do to assist women. She just walked beside people, which is one of the most important things we can do as human beings. And sometimes we can't fix what's out there, but we can always walk beside one another and witness to the trials that people are going through. Another tool that we all have, and I'm holding up now a coping saw, which is a saw that's shaped like a big U, and then it has a blade that goes across the top and a little handle on it. A coping saw carpenters use, and Ben did some carpentry work too, so they would have had a coping saw in their house. And when my husband and I were building our ranch in a very remote ranch area on the lower John Day River, he sent me down to get a hacksaw, which those of you who are familiar with saws, it looks very much like this, but it's longer and it's lower. It's more like a rectangle than a big U. And I got it for him, and he was kind of grumpy. And when I came back, I brought both of them because I saw a hacksaw, but then I saw one like this, and I didn't know what that was. And so I gave him the hacksaw, and he was happy because he'd been kind of grumpy. And then I said, well, what's this? And he said, oh, that's a coping saw. And I said, you mean like I have trouble coping with you? And he said, yeah, it's exactly the same word. It's a good mental health word. And that was my background, was in mental health. And I said, well, what's it used for? And he said, well, it's used to fit things into tight places, like a cabinet into a corner or the edges of a picture frame where you're trying to get it fit really tight. And I still didn't understand why that would be called coping. And he said, well, it's the blade. The blade is really strong, but it's also really flexible. If it's too strong, you'll splinter what you're trying to fit. And if it's too flexible, it'll leave gaps. You have to have both strength and flexibility in order to cope. And he said that out there in the middle of the sagebrush. And I remember thinking, wow, this is mental health meets the Marlboro man. I mean, he's such a cowboy. And later, because I shared this and actually used it in a book, a gentleman said to me, well, another feature of a coping saw is that it allows you to change directions quickly without a lot of friction. Isn't that just an incredibly wonderful metaphor? Well, anyway, I'm a cheap date, but stuff like that really, really makes me happy. And so one of the things that Abigail had at her disposal as a tool was being a more coping kind of person. And she certainly did when, their house the house was burned and there was a tornado, and when Ben had his injury, it was like how she adapted to that. When it came to suffrage, she had a much harder time because she really believed that parades and the suffrage movement back east in particular that went into taverns and broke glasses to try to get people to stop drinking, and that association with women having the vote would be a problem, because she was worried because men had to vote to give women the right to vote. And she was worried that men would think that, oh, if women get the vote, they're gonna prohibit beer, or they're gonna get on juries and they'll find, anything related to alcohol, they'll find us guilty. And so she tried to separate that, which I think was probably a good decision on her part. But as Oregon became part of national associations, she did not want any people from outside Oregon to come in and help do things. She called her efforts oh, my brain just had a little blurb here. It was like a silent campaign, still campaign. That's what she called it, a still campaign. And so that was one-on-one. She wanted women to talk to their husbands. She wanted the husbands who were in support to talk to their friends. It was one-on-one. She met with legislators. She was invited to speak to in Washington State and in Oregon and other legislatures around the country, Illinois, Idaho, about the subject, but it was never kind of, flamboyant or, wild. It was, quiet. It was a still hunt, is what she called it. And as things went on, Oregon had its first campaign to get women to vote in 1884. And to get it on the ballot, first the legislature had to agree. And then the next year, because we only met every other year in Oregon, so it was 2 years before there was a vote. So I think the campaign started in 1882. Both houses of the legislature and the governor agreed that it would go on the ballot in 1884. At that point, Abigail's brother, Harvey, was well educated and the editor of the Oregonian, a competitive newspaper. And he was not in favor of women getting the vote. But she and Abigail's sisters kind of badgered him, met with him, and they convinced him that he should come out in favor of the vote, because most of Abigail's contacts were in the rural areas where women worked beside their men. And they were very much in favor of women getting the vote because they saw their mothers working beside their fathers. These husbands saw their wives as equal partners. But the urban areas were less, they just like, men should take care of their women and women you don't need to worry about it. So, but she convinced him that it would pass. And so shortly before the vote, he came out in favor of women's suffrage, and it lost terribly. And he never, ever, ever again came out in favor of it. In fact, he died in 1910. And women didn't get the vote in Oregon until 1912. So, I mean, every campaign Oregon had 6 campaigns to get the vote. No other state had that many before the vote was given. So was that because Abigail didn't know how to change directions quickly with her coping mechanism? Um, or was there some other reason why Oregon took so long to get the vote? I think in part it was her absolute resistance of any outside suffrage people coming in. There's a great letter in which one of the head of the National Association says, all we can do for Oregon now is to leave her severely alone. And Abigail said, we'll take it from here. The E word stands for engagement. And that's actually a word that means a promise. And that's, why people would get engaged when they were thinking about getting married. It was a promise that they were going to do the work to be able to get married. But it's also a word that means to focus and pay attention, to be engaged. And the thing I've found, whether it's Abigail Scott Duniway, a suffragist, whether it's Jenny Pickett Parrish, who was one of the first physicians in Oregon who worked with children and families, whether it's Natalie Curtis, who I write about in my latest release called The Healing of Natalie Curtis, that the capacity to get focused and to stay focused is absolutely critical for people having success. I listened to an interview with Malcolm, oh gosh, I can't remember his last name. He wrote The Tipping Point, and so you'll all know who that is. But someone asked him, what was it that allowed some people to really be successful and make it? And he said 2 things. He said they have to be they have to have a desire. They have to have that, hope for something, but they also have to be disciplined and be able to stay focused. And Abigail was able to do that. It was her life's work. And that was one of the things that I think enabled her to keep going. There was a study done many years ago of trying to track people who had grown up as children with really rough times, and some of them made it and were good citizens and had good jobs and didn't get involved in criminal justice or alcohol problems or anything, and other kids that didn't make it. This was in the state of Hawaii, and they followed them for 30 years. And I love this study because what they identified is that the kids who could make it, there were like 6 or 7 qualities, but a couple of them were really important to me. And they were at the top of the list. And one is that every child who made it as an adult could name someone in their life who they knew would always be there for them. And often it was a grandparent or a parent or a teacher. But there were a couple of occupations that one wonders how that could be. And one of them was the bus driver. And so children who named the bus driver, that bus driver always looked after them, and they always checked when they got on the bus, maybe saying, how you doing? Your mom feeling better, or whatever it might be. But it was that ability to stay totally engaged, to remember and to witness to that child's journey. And I think that's part of what Abigail's richness was, is that she could stay engaged. And if we're going to get anywhere and going to be disciplined enough to move forward with something, we have to stay engaged. And then the last letter is an S, and it stands for seeking. And that actually goes back to that being a purposeful person, someone who has a desire and is looking to make something happen, has all of the other capacities, whether it's to cope, whether it's to be open, whether it's to understand the vulnerability and the risks that are involved, but that ultimately all of us as human beings share in common a need to seek for something. And C.S. Lewis, who's a theologian, but he has a word, there's a German word called Sehnsucht, which I probably don't pronounce correctly, but those Germans in my world hopefully will understand it. But it means this almost a compulsion to have meaning in our lives. And for Abigail, I think, for it was obviously that desire to make a difference in the lives of women through the vote. But I think it says something for all of us about the importance of having intention, knowing something that we're moving toward, whether you're moving into retirement and, and now you get retired, but what will your retirement look like? What is that desire within that retirement that will keep you moving forward and keep you moving towards finding meaning in your life? Abigail had many trials. She actually passed away in 1915, but she was she was the first person to register to vote in Multnomah County. She was the first person to serve first woman to serve on a jury in Multnomah County. And she left a legacy, even though lots of people in the world don't know who she was. But you can walk around the Northwest and find parks named for her, and schools named for her, and streets named for her. And one of the interesting things that happen when I speak to book groups is that a woman told me they had read Something Worth Doing. And she said she went for a walk in Portland and she came to this park called Duniway Park. And she said to herself, well, I wonder what this man did that he managed to get a park named for him. And then she went to the little, kiosk that explained what it was. And she said, oh, it was a woman. And so she hadn't been aware that the park was named for Abigail Scott Duniway. And I thought how quickly we go to the assumption that if it was a memorial, if it was something that was really treasured, it must have been for a man. And so I love it that some far-thinking people in Portland decided to name this park for a woman. And I think Abigail would have been very happy that it was a park, because the landscape of the Northwest was very precious to her. She loved her Northwest. So that's what votes goes for in this Something Worth Doing. And I just want to close with a quote from Václav Havel, who was a writer, and he became the first president of the Czech Republic. And he was actually jailed earlier in his life for speaking out against communism. And his friend said, you should just shut up because they're going to put you in jail. And that's what they did. But he wrote a book while he was in jail called Disturbing the Peace. And in it, he gave a definition for the word hope, which I think is probably one of the best definitions I've ever read. And he said that hope is an orientation of the spirit. It's an orientation of the heart. It's the ability to begin something, not just because it has a chance to succeed, but because it's a good thing to do. It's not the certainty that everything's going to turn out fine, but the absolute conviction that something is worth doing, regardless of how it turns out. And so I hope that you might take that with you as you move forward to, look in your own life for vulnerabilities, your openness, your capacity to use the tools you've been given to engage and to seek, that you too might be able to find those things that are worth doing. And so I hope today that you had the experience that you came to have. And I thank you so much for your part and letting me have mine. And now we can take some questions.
Well, thank you so much, Jane. That was something worth doing, certainly. Thank you so much for sharing about Abigail Scott Duniway and others, and for the inspiration you've shared with our park over the years. Please ask everyone to mark your calendars for our next In Their Footsteps in a similar format on Sunday, October 17th, when David Nicandri presents Captain Cook, Lewis and Clark, and the Evolution of the Northwest Passage. If you follow Lewis and Clark National Historical Park on Facebook, notification of these virtual events will show up on your newsfeed. Thank everyone for joining us today, and we're going to keep the chat open for a few more minutes. We've hopefully had some questions and answers going in there already, and we'll just keep adding to them until we think there's an end. Thank you, everybody.